I noticed him the first week I moved into the brick walk-up on S.E. Alder, the shadow squared in a lit rectangle across the narrow alley, fixed at the height of my desk lamp. Every night at 8:17, his lamp clicked on, his blinds parted into a thin, perfect aperture, and a silhouette settled where it could see the slice of my living room. I pretended it didn't matter. I told myself it was coincidence, or a trick of reflections, or the way light crawls at dusk in Portland when the sky becomes a wet sheet of paper and the streetlights turn the mist into a halo. But after 7 nights, then 8, then 10, the ritual stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like intent. I set my coffee mug exactly where I knew his gaze would land, then moved it to the couch arm, then to the floor, just to see if the shadow tracked the change. It did. The lamp across the alley blinked once, an electrical hiccup or a yes. That was when I found myself holding my breath in my own living room, an animal pausing in the open. It was the first time I admitted, quietly, that being observed is a kind of leash. And the second time the lamp blinked, I realized the leash could tighten. The next night, I set my phone timer for 8:16 and waited with the lights off, the blinds angled to slits. When the lamp across the way came on and the shadow took shape, I understood 2 things at once. Whoever he was punctual, and whoever I had already started letting him tell my evenings when to begin. My hand hovered over the pull cord that would close my blinds. I didn't pull. I wanted to know what would happen if I didn't. I thought I was staying still, but I had already moved. I wrote his time, 8:17, on an index card and taped it under the edge of my desk. It felt like labeling a specimen. I didn't know I was labeling myself. That night, his lamp blinked twice. I didn't yet know that meant danger. I was 29, newly single, the proud renter of 800 creaking square feet, in a view of the alley where the dumpsters were prettier than my credit score. I worked out of my living room, fact-checking a true crime podcast, popular enough that strangers sometimes told me, with an odd brightness in their voices, that I lived in their ears while they washed dishes or folded laundry or ran at 6 in the morning. The show trained me to listen like a locksmith, finding the tiny tumblers in speech, the places where stories catch or spin. It was a skill that bled into everything else. I mapped my block by sound the first week. Mail slot clanks, the city truck's exhale, the bicycle bell at the corner. Routine is just a loop of noises you stop noticing when you feel safe. I didn't feel safe yet, but I felt proud. I painted one wall a muddy green that looked like a forest if you squinted and forgot you were broke. I stacked my books by size because the shelves were crooked and tall spines kept falling. I arranged my desk so sunlight hit the keyboard in the morning. I was careful with the details I could control. The ones I couldn't, I documented. I had a notebook for that. Addresses that looked like always vacant Airbnbs, plates of cars that idled too long with lights off, hours when the alley cat walked the top of the chain link fence. It wasn't paranoia, it was how I calmed my hands. There had been a man before. He was mostly kind until he wasn't. He kept his sharpness like a pocket knife, out of sight, then suddenly open. When I left, I took my kettle and the couch and the part of me that apologized for needing locks. I changed my number. I didn't forward my mail. Those were easy cuts. The hard ones are always the habits. You trim and new ones grow, and you learn to live with what sprouts. A week after I moved in, my landlord slid a welcome packet under my door. The laundry schedule, the trash days, the emergency contact I hoped I'd never need. I wrote our property manager's name, Trevor, on a sticky note and tacked it inside my kitchen cabinet, where I put the tea. I liked knowing where names lived. I liked knowing what they were supposed to do. That night, the lamp across the alley blinked once. The silhouette didn't move. I realized I had been waiting for it. On a Wednesday, The show I worked for ran an episode on a cold case that had gone viral years earlier and calcified into myth. A woman who vanished after texting her sister not to worry. I spent the afternoon checking timeline details, the color of the bar's sign, the weather that night, the exact phrasing of the text, and I was deep enough in that other woman's life that when my phone buzzed with a new email, I flinched. The subject line said, "Contribution, Night Audio." Listeners sent us things all the time. Voicemails from drunk uncles, blurry photos of bulletin boards, a Bible verse someone's grandmother swore was the key to everything. I clicked because habit is stronger than fear. The file was 2 minutes, mono, recorded on a bad phone or a cheap recorder. The first 20 seconds were my building, the metallic sneeze of our lobby door, the 3-step echo of the stairwell, the hollow chime my unit's lock made when the bolt turned. Then a pause, long enough to be a decision. Then the soft burr of my living room lamp sliding over its dimmer switch, and the quiet, familiar catch of my breath when my desk chair rolled backward a few inches against the rug. It was my room, my lamp, my breath. I replayed it 3 times, listening for a hitch that would make it someone else's life, a neighbor's noise that matched mine, or a similar couch squeak. But the chair's scrape had the exact stutter mine made where the rug wrinkled under the front wheel. I kept my windows shut. I kept my door double locked. The angle that would have picked up those sounds from the outside was the same angle my eyes found when they crossed the alley. At 8:17, I waited by the blinds with my fingers on the slats, the way you wait at a stranger's voicemail, willing them to pick up. The lamp across blinked once, then again. 2 beats. A rhythm that felt like acknowledgement. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write the show's producer. I didn't forward the audio to the contact in the welcome packet. Instead, I drew my blinds halfway and taped my own index card to the glass where his sliver of a view would catch it. On it, I wrote, "Why?" I watched my handwriting float in my window like a captured moth. Across the alley, his lamp didn't waver, but the blinds there twitched and parted wider, as if an eye had widened with them. I couldn't see a face. I could only see a shape and a square of white on his side, a reply card held at chest height. The letters were blocky and careful, as if whoever wrote them had learned once to be legible and wanted to keep that promise. He'd written, "You're not safe." The lamp blinked twice again. I was too scared to move, and I moved anyway. I'm good at angles. Detail is a comfort. I measured the span of my window and the place where the silhouette stood, then sketched the alley on graph paper, turning my life into a map with one reliable landmark, his lamp. I strung cotton thread from my window frame to the corner of my desk and traced where the thread's line hit on the opposite wall. It landed on the seam where paint met plaster, a faint crack like a healed cut. If he had a similar seam, I could guess where his eye would line up with mine. I bought a cheap pair of binoculars from a thrift store, scuffed lenses, a frayed strap that smelled like someone else's winter. I didn't want to become a person who used them. That was a line I still pretended existed. But at 8:16, I washed my hands and set them on the sill. At 8:17, I lifted them like a prayer I didn't believe in. His blinds had been trimmed to the exact height that hid his face but gave him a view of my living room to the ankle bone. The aperture made a letterbox of me. In that slit, I saw the edge of a bookshelf, the square shadow of a metronome, the top of a chessboard arranged mid-game. I watched for breath, his, not mine, but the slit held steady. Then, so small I would have missed it if I wasn't waiting for it. The metronome's pendulum ticked once. It ticked again. Not steady, not regular, responsive. I backed away from the window and walked to my kitchen, set a glass down on the counter, lifted it, set it down again. Across the alley, tick. When I crouched near the floor and touched the rug, the place my chair snagged, tick. When I sat on the couch, the metronome stilled. The message was simple. He could see most of what I chose to do, and he wanted me to know it. Or he wanted someone else to know he knew it. I took notes until my hand cramped. The chessboard's black bishop sat at c6. The white king was castled. A rook hovered in an illegal position, as if someone had cut a move short to answer a door. I don't play, but I know the board enough to recognize interruption. That small wrongness bothered me more than the rest. Someone had arranged a scene for the window, I thought, and then gotten interrupted by the world behind it. The next night, I taped a new card to my glass at 8:10. "Who are you?" His reply didn't come at 8:17. It came at 8:30, after I'd started to hope he had decided not to answer, in fear he had. When it finally lifted into the slit, the card said 3B. I wrote, "Which building?" He wrote, "Mine." The lamp blinked twice. I didn't sleep. At midnight, I moved my couch 7 inches, just enough that I could notice the change when I forgot I'd made it. I took the batteries out of my smoke detector and weighed it in my hand like a question. I only put it back because my chest felt tight and I didn't trust my memory not to burn me. At 2, I sat on the kitchen floor and listened to the building thrum. At 3, I laughed because I could not think of a better word for the exact sound the elevator cable made than ache. At 4, I wrote tomorrow in my notebook, as if naming the next day would make it arrive safely. At 6:30, my inbox pinged. Another audio file from the same anonymous sender. This one was shorter. It wasn't my room. It was the alley. A voice I didn't recognize, deep and smooth and close to the microphone, saying quietly, "Don't turn around." I played it twice before I realized the voice wasn't telling me to stay still in the alley. It was telling me to stay still in my apartment. It was telling me to obey. It was the kind of sentence that sounds like care if you're lonely and a command if you're not. That night at 8:17, his lamp blinked twice again. I told myself it could mean anything, but I already believed it meant danger. The package was on my doormat when I returned from a morning walk that felt like penance. Small, unmarked, the size of a paperback. No return address, no shipper's tape, just a precise fold and a neat strip of brown paper. Inside was a disposable camera, the kind they sell at gas stations for weddings you regret, and an envelope with printed photos developed from a similar camera. The photos were of me, not naked, not romantic, not obscene. The horror was their correctness. I was photographed washing a mug in my sink, shoulders hunched, tying my shoe by the door, hair falling across my cheek, standing in my living room counting breaths, because counting is what I do when my thoughts start to gallop. Each photo was stamped with a date from the last 10 days, a cool yellow font that looked like honesty. I counted the pictures against my calendar. The timestamps lined up with 8:17 Some nights 2 shots, some 1, one night none. The none night was the night the thunder cracked over Mount Tabor and our block went dark. It should have made me feel better. It only meant whatever camera watched me needed my lights. The thought landed like a pebble and made rings. I lifted the smoke detector again, pried the cover with a butter knife, and found nothing but a circle of dust. I checked the corners for pinhole lenses and metal glints, pressed my ear to the outlets, slid a hand under the couch, touched the underside of the coffee table where chewing gum might hide a tracker if my life were a show and the show liked to cheat. My hand shook with how silly it felt to touch everything I owned like I was discovering it for the first time. At 8:17, his lamp blinked twice, then once a beat, then again, an almost pattern, like a person trying to speak a language he'd let rust for years. I opened my notes app to a Morse code cheat sheet and matched the blink lengths to letters. It took 3 tries to understand because the timing was sloppy and because I didn't want to understand. The sequence said, "Don't turn around." I stood in the center of my living room, the way you stand when you expect to be judged for posture, and stared at my own window, and, stubborn, turned slowly anyway. At first, I saw nothing but my wall, hung with the framed print I had bought at a salvage sale, a sketch of a lark in a cage, so sentimental it became an inside joke with myself. Then I saw the hairline scratch in the paint along the top edge of my bedroom door. It had 2 arcs across it, as if a keyring had scraped there when someone's hand turned a knob that shouldn't have been turned. I had a deadbolt. I had a chain. I had a door sweep with bristles like a trimmed beard. But in the middle of my door, a key had kissed the paint. I touched the mark with the pad of my thumb. The paint flaked like snow. Over the next hour, every settler in my body packed up and left. I camped in the kitchen with the oven mitts on my hands because I needed to hold something, and I didn't trust my fingers not to call someone I would regret calling. I typed, then deleted, then typed again a message to Trevor, our property manager, and stopped because the thought of explaining the lamp and the metronome and the metonymy of my own life made me feel like a child describing a monster under a bed to a man who would smile and tell me monsters aren't real. At midnight, I put the disposable camera in my pocket. It felt like a dare. The next morning, exhaustion made me efficient. I wrote Trevor. I kept it clean. An unauthorized entry, a mark by the door, photographs delivered without request. I didn't mention the neighbor's lamp or any code or the chessboard. I didn't mention that I counted my breaths for company. He replied within an hour, professional and short. He'd replaced the lock. He'd checked the building's master keys. He'd reviewed the lobby camera. He'd get me a new peephole with a wider angle. It was exactly the email you send when you know what a tenant needs to hear. It calmed me because I wanted to be calmed. By noon, a locksmith had installed a new deadbolt with a proud, shiny face and a mouth I believed in. Trevor stood in my hallway holding a clipboard, making careful notes I couldn't read from where I hovered near the kitchen. He had neat hands, clean nails, a tiny ink stain on his thumb in the shape of a comma. He kept his voice low, the way people do when they want to layer trust onto the air. He said the right words: protocol, audit, access list, safety. He took photos of the scratch on my door, and I told myself it mattered that he documented what the old luck had failed to keep out. That night, I arranged the photos from the envelope in a line on the floor. In the lamplight, they looked like stills from an experiment where I was both researcher and rat. I asked the ceiling a question and got no answer. If I was safer, why didn't it feel like it yet? At 2 a.m., I opened a new audio session for the episode due Friday. I layered my producer's voice, the interview, the stingers, the ad spots. In the quiet, I heard a faint breath under the narration. Mine, but not currently mine. I muted each track until the breath remained on its own. The file information called it Ambiance B Night 02.wav, a neutral label assigned by a neutral system. The waveform jittered like a thin fire. I measured the breaths, 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, and waited for the part of me that likes to know to say something. It did. These were my breaths counted on a night I had stayed very still. The track ended not with silence, but with the audible click of my living room lamp turning off. The length of the file? 7 minutes, 18 seconds. At 8:17, my lamp turned on. At 8:24, it turned off. The timing was a geometry proof. When the track stopped, I sat on the floor with my legs tucked under me and realized my relief had been a costume. It had looked good in the mirror. It didn't fit when I tried to walk. At 8:17 the following night, the lamp across the alley did not turn on. My chest unspooled. For one beat of idiot hope, I thought, fixed. But 2 minutes later, a red dot kindled on my ceiling where the smoke detector sat, a muted ruby the size of a fruit fly, a light I had not seen before because I had not looked up at the wrong moment. The dot blinked once, then twice. I stood on a chair, twisted the detector off its bracket, and set it gently on my table like an egg I was afraid to crack. The plastic cover came free under my fingernail. Inside, the usual disc and the usual screws, and nested in the lower curve like it had been meant to be there, a thumb-sized camera, snugged in foam and wired with a small battery that wouldn't have lasted long if someone didn't check it often. My name didn't make a sound when I said it out loud to the empty room, but my hands did. I wasn't shaking from fright anymore. I was shaking from the tilt in the world when you're suddenly right. The camera had a micro SD card slotted into its side. I removed it, set it next to my keyboard, and watched it sit there like a dark tooth. I did not plug it in immediately, the way you don't immediately read a letter you know will cut you. Instead, I walked to the window, held up a card with 2 words, "Found camera," and waited. Across the alley, no lamp, no metronome, no movement. It felt like being abandoned by a warning. I put the card into my laptop and opened the first file. The video was time-stamped for the previous night. The angle looked down at my living room from the smoke detector's perch. I watched myself move through my apartment, small as a doll. Then I watched myself sleep on the couch like a person who didn't trust their bedroom door yet. I watched the minute hand of the clock nudge toward 8:17, and then I watched my front door open without my body getting up to open it. A figure entered and stood in the bedroom doorway. Tall, shoulders squared, a baseball cap pulled low, a hoodie zipped halfway. He didn't move for 30 seconds. He didn't move for 60. Then he took 3 steps toward the couch, bent slightly, and the video swallowed his face in shadow. He turned his head toward the ceiling as if he could hear the small electric hunger of the camera and was deciding whether to feed it. He lifted his hand. On his wrist, beneath the cuff, a crescent of ink showed. 2 thin lines crisscrossed like a compass without the circle. He stayed long enough to memorize the room, then left. The door closed with the same tender carefulness I give my cabinet where I keep my tea. I scrubbed back through the timeline and watched again. The compass lines, faint, cut by the edge of his sleeve, jogged something loose in my head. It wasn't a memory so much as a filed image labeled "See Also." In the welcome packet, a photo of Trevor had sat above his email address, beside the phrase "property manager." In the photo, his left wrist rested on the clipboard, a small compass tattoo peeking from under a cuff. I tried to convince myself compass tattoos were common. Then I tried to convince myself my fear was a projector casting meaning on whatever it wanted. Then I did the only thing that felt like choosing. I stood on my desk chair, stretched a new card across my window, and wrote, in letters I wanted to look like a command, "Help." For the first time in 2 nights, the blinds across the alley moved. A card lifted, slow and steady, like someone lifting a weight that mattered. It said, 3B, door unlocks. I wrote, when. He wrote, after a pause long enough for me to understand what it means to risk a stranger with the key, now. I put on my boots because I couldn't think about my ankles being bare in a hallway where anything could open. I didn't call the police because telling a story before you have its shape is like handing someone a weapon and asking them to guess which way it points. I tucked my phone into my pocket, screen recording already on, and stepped into my hall. The stairwell smelled like dust and old heat. On the second floor, a door with the number 3B waited in the middle of a row like an even tooth. The knob turned without resistance. The room breathed cool when I stepped inside, the way rooms do when they haven't had a person in them for a while. It took 2 seconds to understand that the window across from mine had been curated. A mannequin sat in a chair at the exact height a body would settle if it wanted to be witnessed. A cap tilted on the mannequin's head, a hoodie draped its shoulders. The chessboard on the side table held the same unfinished game. The metronome lay on its side. The lamp across the alley, the one I had been watching, was on a timer. If someone wanted to feign presence at 8:17 for a person in the building opposite, they had everything a lie needed to look like a life. The rest of the apartment was an archive. On the wall behind the chair hung a grid of photos that weren't art. They were evidence. The images were crisp and careful. The lobby's camera with a loop of faces, mail carrier, dog walker, Trevor with a clipboard, the master key ring photographed beside a quarter for scale. A journal's page with a neat hand writing something like 817 observed entry. The handwriting was tidy but urgent in the way tidy can be when it's trying not to be a scream. A newspaper from 6 months ago lay folded to an obituary for a woman in her 30s who used to live in our building. Someone had underlined the phrase, private service. A notebook on the table by the mannequin's stiff hand held columns of times and dates and initials. T. Entry 817. T. Exit 823. Door relocked, no visible disturbance. A name on the inside cover. Owen Bartlett. The numbers 3B circled. I turned a page. On it, taped carefully, was a photocopy of a lease addendum. Emergency access policy for property managers, with a list of apartments and their master key codes. The code for my apartment had a tiny asterisk beside it. In the margin, someone had written, "Asked Trevor to change cylinder, he declined. Budget." I took out my phone and photographed every page. I didn't touch the drawers. I didn't open the closet. I didn't have to feel the absence in the room. Someone had planned to be here a long time, then had left in a hurry, then had planned to return. And they wanted me to enter. The door had been left unlocked for me. The mannequin had been turned toward my window for me. The grid of photographs was a choir singing one thing: believe the pattern. As I wrote the name Owen into my notebook, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Slow, measured, not stealthy, but not friendly. The kind of walk a person does when they don't worry about being noticed. The knob twisted once and stopped. Whoever was on the other side of the door didn't try again. The footsteps drifted toward the stairwell and dissolved. I waited long enough for my legs to hurt from not moving, then slipped into the hall. On the landing, a small security camera puck had been mounted where the hall turned. It was new enough to shine. A red dot winked in its eye. Back in my apartment, I stacked Owen's notes on my table in my head, because I didn't dare bring them over with my hands. I wrote a report for myself. A tenant in 3B documented a pattern of unauthorized entries by Trevor at 8:17 p.m. across multiple apartments. The tenant attempted to warn me with light signals. The tenant may have been removed. The tenant planned for me to find his notes. I read the words like they were someone else's. They were and they weren't. I filed a police report. It was, in the end, unavoidable. The officer on the phone was courteous. He gave me a case number. He told me to forward any evidence. He told me to avoid direct confrontation. He told me, without guile and without understanding that it made my throat tighten, that if I felt unsafe, I should stay with a friend. I didn't say that I had built a life so careful it didn't leave room for people to invite me over when I panicked. I didn't say I'd chosen the couch in a living room because my bedroom felt like a throat I could get stuck in. I sent them stills of the man at my door and a blurred frame of the compass tattoo. I attached a clipped audio file of my living room door opening. I typed the name, Owen Bartlett, and felt like I was adding a ghost to a spreadsheet. That afternoon, my boss emailed about a delay in the episode. I typed a reply and erased it. The only truth I could write was, I am being watched, and it didn't belong to that inbox. At 8:17, I stood where I always stood and felt the absence across the alley like a pulled tooth. The window in 3B stayed dark. My living room's edges felt too sharp. The lamp hummed louder than any machine that small should. I angled my blinds, then angled them again, as if a different slant could change the story. A power flicker blew the apartment into brief night. When the lights were turned, my phone's screen stayed black. The surge had wiped its small brain. In the quiet afterward, the building sighed the way buildings sigh when they hold too many people pretending to sleep. Across the alley, a shape moved in the stairwell on 3B's side, not in the window but behind it. A cart lifted into the projection of streetlight on glass, not legible from my angle, but unmistakably there. I moved 3 inches to my left, then 2, until the card's letters cleared, like a photo resolving. The scrawl wasn't Owen's square hand. It was heavier, more careless, but the words were plain. Are you home? I held up a blank card because I didn't want to answer that question. Then I wrote, police. A beat. The card on the other side lowered and then returned, new words in the same hand. Don't talk to them. I felt alone in the way that makes your knees want to fold. It wasn't simply that someone planned to enter, it was that someone felt entitled to the narrative of my reaction. I wrote nothing else. I turned out my lamp and sat in the dark and listened to my building breathe. The text came from an unknown number at 7:53. If you go to 3B again, take the fire stairs to the roof. He won't follow you up there. I stared and tried to fit the voice in my head next to what I'd read in the notebook. It was spare and direct. It felt like a person who was learned not to waste words. Who is this? I typed. No reply. At 8:10, I left my apartment without turning off the light. It was petty, but I wanted my room to look inhabited, and I wanted the person who expected me not to call the police to think I was as naive as he needed me to be. I took the back stairs, the ones half the building forgot existed, and crossed to 3B's hall. I didn't hesitate at the door this time. The room accepted me like a secret deciding I was durable enough to hold it. I moved quickly. I took photos of the lease addendum, the photos of Trevor's keys, the lists of initials and times. I slid a paperclip into my coat pocket that had been bent and rebent into an odd shape, as if someone had used it to pick a lock and wanted the metal to remember. I opened the drawer of the side table because this time I had decided to cross that line, and found, wrapped in tissue, a small flash drive labeled with a piece of blue tape, T817 Master. On the back, one more line of tidy handwriting. If you're reading this, I'm late. I almost didn't check the bathroom. I'm not brave. I'm only obedient when a pattern tells me it expects me to follow. Behind the shower curtain, hanging on a hook, was a jacket that smelled like lemon cleaner and cold. In the pocket, a wallet, Oregon ID, Owen Bartlett, an address across the river, a bus pass, a grocery club card, no cash, no credit cards. It felt like a man had been paused in the middle of his life. Footsteps approached down the hall, not careful, coming at an ordinary pace, which felt worse. I took the flash drive and the wallet and stepped into the bathroom, then into the tub, then up onto the lip of the window where a narrow metal ladder led to the fire escape. The window stuck. Paint held it shut like dried honey. I pressed harder than I meant to. The window gave with a sound that felt like a confession. I climbed out into air and pulled the window closed behind me. The fire escape clanged under my feet. The clanging was a language, and in that moment, I begged its grammar to be a bluff. I climbed anyway, up and up until the metal turned to roof. The city smelled like rain and hot rubber. I crouched behind the chimney and waited. Through the micro gap where the roof line met the brick, I saw a shape enter 3B. Tall, square shoulders, cap, hoodie. Trevor. Or a man wearing Trevor. He moved like he had ownership of time. He stood at the window. He looked across at my living room, at my lamp still on, at my blinds canted in the way I hoped said, a woman at home, complacent. He stayed a long moment as if a pause could be an alibi if anyone asked him later what he had been doing. Then he turned to the chair where the mannequin sat and adjusted its cap by an inch. He reached for the metronome, set it upright, and nudged the pendulum with one finger. It ticked twice and stopped. He opened the drawer of the side table I had opened and closed it with care that would have seemed gentle if I didn't know what tenderness had been performing for. He looked at the door, at the frame, at the floor. He looked for someone who knew the room differently now. He didn't look up at the bathroom window. A good hunter learns where prey doesn't go. I stayed until my thighs trembled from the crouch. When he left, he didn't lock the door. He didn't need to. He wanted the room to be a mouth that breathes his plans. On the roof, my phone finally lit with a bar of reception, a stubborn, merciful thread. A second text arrived from the unknown number. He changed his route. He goes up after 8:30 some nights now. I typed, Owen? Then, are you alive? No reply. The three little dots pulsed, then died. I walked the roof line to the far end and let myself down into my building's hall, then into my apartment. I shut my door and leaned my forehead against the wood. The metal of the new deadbolt kissed my skull through the paint. Without thinking, I set my recorder on the bookshelf and hit record. I set a second in the bedroom under the bed and a third in the kitchen inside the cabinet where I keep the tea. I turned out all but one lamp and sat on the couch like a person waiting for a test to begin. At 8:17, the building exhaled. I listened through the wall first, because walls conduct intent if you know how to hear it. The stairwell whispered once. The hall carpet sighed. My door breathed when the key went into the lock. A body cares for a door it believes is its own. The bolt turned. The chain slid. The sweep hushed the floor. He stepped in the way you step into a place you intend to rearrange, not too carefully, confident in his own myth. I didn't move. He paused in the threshold the way he had in the video, as if he had trained himself to love the small thrill of standing where someone sleeps. He walked past me to the bedroom and stood in the doorway. He stood long enough to write himself a memory of my bed's shape. He turned toward the living room and tilted his head up half an inch, like a man sniffing air. I had wedged a tiny slip of foil into the smoke detector's casing, enough to create static on a cheap receiver. He stared at it. He smiled a smile that wasn't for me. He stepped closer to the couch. He didn't reach for me. He wasn't that stupid. He studied my desk, my notes, the index card with 817 written in blue pen. His eyes moved like they were cataloging. He liked to file. He liked to keep. Don't, I said, and the word was a sound I wanted on record, not for him. He turned toward me, expression carefully composed into concern that would photograph well. Maintenance check, he said, quiet, as if quiet could make the lie softer in my ear. His tone was a knife you could butter bread with. It would cut you only if you were tired. I was tired, and I also had 3 recorders running and the flash drive in my pocket, and a room in 3B where the chessboard remained in a permanent mid-game to remind me that interruption is evidence if you refuse to complete the story for your predator. I filed a police report about a man coming in at 8:17. They have footage now. That last part wasn't true yet, not in the official way, but I needed him to feel watched for once by someone whose gaze had teeth. He looked at my door, at the lock he had installed. He kept his voice low. I'm sorry you felt unsafe, he said, a sentence that works whether you plan to stop or not. I know about 3B. I know about Owen. The name was a key in the room. It unlocked a tiny flicker across his face, then the flicker smoothed and became a surface again. Old tenant, left in a hurry, happens. I had planned to wait for the police, the way a person waits for a train they want to believe is on time, despite every schedule in their life. But sitting still while he theorized my safety made something else rise in me, something that had lived under the couch while I counted breaths. My body stood up before my mind gave it a permission slip. I stepped around him, crossed to the window, and tugged my blinds open so the alley could see everything. I reached to the lamp and flicked it off, then on, then off, then on twice, as if I were restitching a sentence I had been told to obey. Don't turn around. Now I wanted the alley to watch me confront the command and teach it a different grammar. He stepped forward, not a lunge, but a calibration. He adjusted how his shoulders squared, as if to present the right silhouette to the right witness. I backed toward the hall. My phone sat on the console table by my keys. Camera facing forward, screen black, recording already begun. It caught his approach in the glossy reflection, cap, hoodie, compass tattoo. He reached the couch and paused again, head tilted, calculating the room's angles. The second recorder under the couch clicked and kept counting. He wanted to ask me to calm down. He wanted to say I was overreacting. He wanted to say he had a right to be here. I could feel the phrases before they would exist. That is the curse of listening for a living. You start hearing the future tense. I didn't give him a script to stand on. I walked to the door and put my hand on the knob. You need to leave. I said a simple sentence, deliberately small. He took one step as if to test what kind of movement this room would allow him to make. That was when the siren yelped on the block, and I watched his left eye shrink against the sound before he could decide on a better reaction. It wasn't for us. It was a car passing by. But he had heard his version of the future in it. He went very still. Then he smiled again, the same smile he had practiced in 3B for the window he wanted to control. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said. "I'll bring paperwork." "Bring the police," I said. I opened the door wide so the hall could see us like a stage. He looked past me, measuring witnesses. He adjusted his cap and walked out like a good manager leaving a tense meeting with a difficult tenant. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. Men like him assume the door will always fit their key again. When he was gone, my knees loosened. I shut the door, slid the chain, set the deadbolt. I pulled the drawer of my console open with hands that wanted to tremble and didn't because they were too tired. I took out the flash drive. I put it next to the micro SD on my table. I sat on the floor and let the room's heat rise around me like an animal settling on my lap. Then I did the only thing I knew how to do better than be afraid. I documented. I exported the files. I labeled each clip. I emailed the case number and attached the video with the compass tattoo in 3 places. I sent a copy to my producer with no explanation except, if something happens, make this loud now. At 8:46, there was a knock on my door. Gentle. 2 beats. Not the way he had entered. I didn't move. The knock came again, then an envelope slid under the door. Inside, a key. On the plastic head, a piece of tape with my unit number and a scrawled, shaky note. He keeps a copy in the basement fuse box. Roof, second panel, right side. -O. I sat with the key in my hand until the metal warmed. The police came the next day, not because my story was finally neat, but because it was finally heavy. Evidence has a weight you can feel if you put enough of it in your mouth and try to speak. They found the key box in the fuse cabinet where the note said it would be. They asked Trevor to explain a set of master keys photographed beside a quarter for scale. He denied. He hired a lawyer. It didn't matter immediately. It never does. But it mattered that the story had left my apartment. It mattered that when they searched 3B with the warrant, they found the mannequin and the metronome and the grid of faces and a thumb drive with the label T817 Master. It mattered that on the drive were thumbnails of my apartment and others and a video of my living room door opening at a time when I sat in a different room holding my knees. It mattered that the compass tattoo on his wrist appeared in a charity 5K photo his company's website had been proud to share. They asked me how I knew to go to 3B. I said, a neighbor told me. They asked me for his full name. I said, Owen Bartlett. They asked me where he was. I said, gone. The word felt honest enough. 2 weeks later, the show aired an episode we hadn't planned to make about how women learn to inventory their lives because someone else keeps trying to count them. I didn't say my name on air. I didn't have to. People in our building recognized the alley. Someone left flowers at 3B's door with a note that said, "Thank you for watching." A week after that, an email arrived from the address that had sent the audio files. No subject, no body. An attachment, a photo of the roofline with the moon hung above the brick like a coin you could take if you agreed to owe someone forever. In the bottom corner, a thumb cast the shadow. Alive, gentle, moving into frame. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I moved my couch against the opposite wall. I replaced the lamp with a new one that clicks loud enough to make the room answer. I kept the index card under my desk with 817 on it, not as a warning, but as a clock I had learned to set. I memorized the sound my door makes when it shuts well. I trained myself to hear its twin, a bad close, and I fixed it every time. I changed the way I worked at night. I left fewer silences for other people's plans to stretch in. Some evenings, my hand still moves toward the blinds at 8:16. I let it. Routine is a loop, and some loops you keep because they teach you where you were weak. I open the slats and look across the alley at the dark window of 3B and the rectangle where a mannequin once sat sentry, for a man who learned to direct a room with his absence. The glass is a mirror now. It gives me back a woman with a notebook and a kettle and a lock she trusts because she knows exactly who tried to make it a suggestion instead of a boundary. Every night at 8:17, I still check the glass, not to see if someone is watching me, but to remember that I finally learned to watch back.